Alo e Taumoepeau ya ko kore ke ufanga i ngai whatap ko tō beu whaki me he ngalu ope.
Ke Mamate, I asked him to ring.
Ke whakahoko ai polokalama o e whiawhini. Ko e Kaveinga ki he whiawhini, ko e Mamate ai ā-takaí. Ko e whakarea ia ki he climate change, Fola-he-Ngalú, ko e mahina koen ko me. Ko e polokalama, ko e haawhanga. Pea wia e te whakawhi mai e kau whakalanga taka noa e toko wha, pea ku iheni e toko tolu e taimini. Ko e uruaki ko Ungatea whanua Kata me i Tonga. Ko Ungatea ku ni te whtoi ngā we wi whasmoeafi i he titi ai. Kau foki he ki ko miti, na e toki whakatuu ke tokanga ke climate change, Mamate ā-takaí i Tonga. Tau amnak be e mauongongo me Ungatea i he whiawhini. Ko e whakarangata anoa hono hoko ko Palatasa Havea, ko e tare kita ia i he programa Pasifika a Massey University. Ia ki mo aina e ko taha e kau scientist i he frontera i New Zealand pe moia. Ko e hono tolu ko Taholo kami. O tikai ke asma Taholo ka ko Taholo ko e ngau e Fiji. Pea i ngahi whatongia ke hepe ko taha ngahi whatongia nei kau kia Taholo ko e kau he kau wharei. Ke timi e bure anga Fiji nei alu ki he COP whamui whikawaki ko te mo climate change. Pea ko tau hawhanga whamui ko Latai Taumoepeau me Aositelēlia. Te tau ngāwe aku hange ko e rea nā tau ngāwe aki he tau Fola-he-Ngalú whamui te tau rea ua he whiawhini, both in Tongan and in English. Ko hi u ni ihi o mahino o be rea whakatonga, ki ka uiké ke fuloko lava o rea aki. Sayang e be ke rea whakapalang mai be a Latai, pia mo Taholo i he taimi o ku na whima uke na rea whakapalang i ai. E maru whakaapa nge be na rea whakapalang i hana la pavare ka tau toi loa loa. Kai ke ko Latai Taumoepeau, she is an artist and an activist on many things, human rights and climate change. Most recently, she is in Melbourne for a project on Fola-he-Ngalú, and hopefully she'll talk more about the connection between her work as an activist and the struggle with climate change. So welcome to everyone. Welcome to the members of this hauwhanga. And I'll ask Ungatea to get us started. And then after Ungatea, then Palatasa. Malo Ungatea.
Ko korepeke u whātapu ki a whea toam I he tau rotonga pa. U whangate ngai whātapu wha o atu me he Fola-he-Ngalú. We, amore ka pa ki hala whuki ku whatonulea ke whui platformu sioni whamore. Ka ko whenga maari e ko ni, whamalo atu ko hiko no whakakau atu ki mautolu me I Tonga ki he talatala noa ko ni. Hangepe ko e whakatau kei anenai sione I he kamata e prokalamani. Ko whinumotu ani na maukau atu ki he komiti ki he climate change pe ko wakaivo ki he whatonlea ko ni prokalama I whiawhini ki he Mamate o ā-takaí. Pe ufu mahino kaupo ko e Mamate whakatohema pe ko e Mamate o ā-takaí I he anga ai tau sio kana e tau e ua pe tau ki mua I he whai koe na konwheniski haapai na e whai ai ai whakatala noa ai SIASI ki he pure anga ki ha whaahinga whounga e whengawe aki ai SIASI mo pure anga ki hono ke whakailo lahi ange ai I siu koe ni ko e Mamate o ā-takaí pe ko e feliliuaki o ea pe ko e ki he ngā ue koe SIASI. Pea I he konferenisi koe ni na e whakahoko ki ha pai, na e tāri ai e konferenisi ke iai ha komiti makehe ke ne tokanga ki he ā-takaí, ki he koe ke tokanga ki ā-takaí, ke tokanga ke whengawe aki mo ngahi sino o hange koe pure anga, ke lava ke tokonia a SIASI, ke whakaivia a SIASI, ke ne lava mo ia o tokoni ki hono whakailoa, pe whakatokangai o e isiu koe mamate o e ā-takaí ki he kāinga ki he kakai Tonga. Mahalo koe whainga maari e koe ne whai e talanoa koe ni, koe uiké ko whakapa au pito koe paukai koe whakalanga mamahi. Kana I he pure anga I he taimi koe ni a toke tā ne tatua pleskoti tau whatofua, pea koia na e whai kia e whakatalanoa ke waa ngā ue koe ne mei te ki, I he ā-takaí, aia o ku taki ai a Luisa tuia fitu, pea mei he tau ko ia, na e whai le vai a talanoa koe uhi, he uke ai e whai ngā maari e me he Green Climate Fund, mō tōpe mō mea I muri, koe fwoi tānak paanga ia ai ngahi whonua ai o kunau tu maari e, ke o mai ki ha fwoi pool, ke whai aki e tokoni ke ngahi whonua a whakapaanga ai o kuwesia, ilonga wesia lahi ai mamate a ā-takaí. Neongo, o ku isi upe mo ia whoke taha. Nau tānak paanga ki he fwoi kato koe ni, I he taimi tātau, koe ngahi whonua whoke nia, o kai ngahi whonua o te ke whakamoo nia, ke ngahi area pau ke holoki ai tukuanga atu e kāponi mo holoki na ngahi umea koe ia. Kai ke, koe isi ui, ka koe mea koe tokanga kia SIASI, I he komiti koe ni, ke lava ai whengawe akme pure anga, ke tawhe mai ha se niti mei he pure anga, ke lava ke hanga SIASI o wakai o ku whewhe a ene toka te rine, mo talanoa I o ene teolosia, mo hono mo ui aki ene kau ngawe whawhaiwhe kau, ai ngahi ilo whaono pōni, ai o ku mau, mei he ngahi whatotolo whamumuitaha, mo ngahi mea o ku mahino, o ku whia mau ke ilo, ai kau ngawe whawhaiwhe kau ki ai, pea ai au nau taki foki, I he anga o e mau nofo I he whangaki I kolo, kau he ngahi leo o ku whakatokangai, I he anga o e mau nofo koe I tongani I he ngahi whangaki I kolo. Koe ia koe, maasione koe ki I whama opo pe ia o e anga koe o e ngau, e koe taimini o mau ke I whengau e akpa mo e meiteki, ke whai e whotutu o si whahu atu ke ko tongani koe meiteki koe halanga ia ke whai ai kore koe ke seniti ke GCFA, ka ukai penga hei u whanki halanga kehe, ne os whai kore ki he potungao e koe, ma oe whanki seniti, ke whai whanki savea ke tukunga ilo koe e kau whai whekau, ki he ngahi whangaki mea koe ni whikau aku mamate o e ā-takaí, pea aku mei ai, ai whakaku o se ai e ki proposal ia, pa kou tuipe te tok tānoa kai ka kou siope community me osi. Kai tukuang ka tau toki ai ha whehu I ki ai, pe tau hoko atu ki ai.
Mahalo Ungatea, sa tau kamata ng mahino kia tokanga mai SIASI I Tonga ki he climate change. Ito inia pe koe hae tokanga, hae mea e whai I he whunga o tokanga koe ia. Tau hoko kia Palatasa, Kata ki Palatasa.
Mahalo awito pagu korat beli hufangate he tala whakatapu he forum ko ni kai ado I tala te upe. Ko whamore pena ke fu mahino ka au e context ko e tala no ko ni. Ako ku whafu atu pe o kuai kakai me ko ka tau kakai I wotu amo mamani o ku mahawinga ke mahino ka nao tonu. issue when we climate change. Ku mahalo ku mea e ka kai ko to ape ko liu ko na e a me te whak whakasainisi. O ku whakatupu ia he lahi langa whakalakalaka mo te aitokanga i Ātakaí. A mamani. Ai au taupehe ko hangepe ko ni ko a te tau whatata again. Ko whepuna aki ko waha a toki opa molontoni he tau ko toa pe. O ku ne hanga tam toni carbon ai toni petrolo. Te ao ono ngofu tupu miliona he tau. Ki he ea, ki he atmosphere. Ai a koe whakafuafua ko ne produce toni carbon dioxide ni mange au ua te mange au tolu noa miliona he tau. Ai a koe ko whepuna ake bea he waha o London mo New York. Kata e lau ai whepuna ake he waha o New York mo ngai whanua ke he mo ngai. Ai a koe te whakafuafua tulewa ke he lahe carbon dioxide o tamu he ea. O ku lahi whauwhaua. Ka koe whakalaka a mamani o ku pehe, o ku alo he ngai mea ke ke. Ka koe o la kovi koe o whakalaka mo e tae tokanga ke Ātakaí. Koe whangi whanua hange ko Tonga. Te nau fua no kanonga tamaki. Aia koe tamu koe ai carbon dioxide ki he ea. Ne hanga koe mea koe neu ne form e whahinga mea taha koe carbonic acid. Vai alo koe acid koe ia ne hanga ea ririwe pH koe vai. O ngangana ke tahi. Pa koe konga lahe ika pa moe wheo moe hafua he tahi o nau sensitive au bito ki he liu si bea pH. Pa koe mea rewa hoko koe si iange i ka tau te whito ki he ika wofi mai ki uta wala whaangota e tau kakai mo whingota mo mea. Taku nau mate nau tole, wawe mate ai o mea koe ia pia ku mate ai wheo pe alu. Wako lahi mo ngai mea behe, he? Me i wheki koe ai carbonic acid. A koe aia koe mea koe ia ku ne hanga o ririwe ai whakanatula, Wala koe a carbon dioxide une te hanga. Mau e fo i hanga fo i oso koe mea koe ā-Aositelēlia wilo behe. Mau mea behe o e ki kakai. Ko ne awa koe abia ku haorewa whahinga ray light waves me laana to ton ki hao ki mamani. Ko ngau e ā-Aositelēlia ko ne hanga bounce peke. Ai u sunlight ko ni. Ai ko ne hawa na koe ki mamani pa ku increase lewa temperature mamani. Ai ko e kapa e awa do o awe increase ko temperature mamani on average ki se degree ta. I over he taha. Ka koe mea ko une hanga ko whakatupu extreme weather ko tau siwa he taimi. Alo mawhananga mamani. Ia koe hiti ko ia o ku feliliuaki ko hiti ko he funga mamani mo funga whanua o ne hanga ia ko se extreme climate ko tau siwa he taimi. Fu momoko abita ngai taimi momoko be fu vela abita taimi vela bagu. Ne kos a wha ngai a wha ia mo mea ke ke tau siwa doha mea pe pagu alu ke koviang. Panga ni au koe ke koviang o mau ingarewa ke tau whakaukau ma teu. Tata whiti whangi whanua hanga ko Tonga. Hea tau mea e whai. Ke tau tokoni ki he mea kwani. A koe mahalo koe ki tala teu bea te ora lata taimini. Kau whanonga. Ka kudui e te tau si o tu bea e tau tala noa hanga he mea te tau ala whai ke tokoni ki. Ka tau tolu. Ka moe. Mau wenu ku hoko ki mamani he taimini. Malo si ada kau join ko over time ya gue.
Malo Palatasa. Tau time whakatonga pe whakatau tolu. Malo abito whakatau kei le rei ko ke whai. Taholo kamini sampula Taholo has arrived, and we'll ask Taholo to please turn on your camera and share your thoughts on this subject. Malo.
Malo lelei from Suva, kolege hufanga ngai whakatapu ke tāke hoko atu ki whatongia ngai ni. Te ki lele le whakapritania, mahino anga ko le whakapalangi, le whakatonga. But just, you know, I don't want to get into the science of this. I think some of this has already been covered by the professor and also Ungatea from Tonga. And good to see all of you online. Just some issues. A little bit on my background, since I think I'm the newer one on this one. Is I'm based in Suva, and I've been working with the environment and on ocean and climate change issues for the last 12 to 15 years from the Pacific. And just a few little things I want to add to the current discussion. One of them is the role of the church and how we should see this as Christians and as Tongans and Pacific Islanders. And climate change is not just an issue of science, but I think the interest of this, it's a moral issue. I think it's even bigger than that. I think it's a spiritual issue. And it stems from many of the things that we deal with in terms of our Christian message, that it comes from this whole issue of consumerism, the whole me society, and our demand to buy, to purchase, to own, and to consume far beyond our means. And also you could add the word there, greed, just human greed, in terms of how we've exploited the planet, exploited the resources that God has given us, and basically overstepped our boundaries. And when you look at, if we are to believe in creation, and you look at the planet that God created and gave to us to be stewards, it came with checks and balances. It came with a source of oxygen that we could breathe. And the trees and all the greenery around us give oxygen. The ocean, every second breath comes from the ocean. The ocean also produces oxygen. And then what we've seen is that, just for example, with oxygen, is that we've broken that cycle in terms of we've damaged, we've polluted, we've reduced the quantities and the qualitative services that are provided by the environment in producing clean air that we can breathe. And when you look at the cause of that, much of that has happened in the last 50 to 70 years, and our population has increased by several billion. We've more than doubled our population in a period of something like 50 years or something. And if you start to look at the numbers, the impact that we as humans have had on the planet, I don't think 100 years from now we could have foreseen the kind of impact industrialization that has been created or has created these incredible demands that we've had on nature, and the impact that has come out of them. Climate change is a direct result of this. Professor Havea was talking about the carbon sink and the surfaces of the ocean, that it's the world's biggest carbon sink. It's also the world's biggest heat sink. And there's some basic things that we know. We're hitting temperatures in the ocean every year in this part of the world, Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, in this area, where the ocean's easily hitting 30 degrees almost every year now. 30 degrees means that you get hit by a certain storm at the right time, around this time when the ocean's there. The likelihood of that reaching extreme, not category 2 or category 3 hurricanes, but getting to category 5 is very likely. And I think most of us can say that in our lifetime, we haven't seen as many category 5 hurricanes that we have seen and experienced in the last 15 years compared to the rest of our life. And there's obviously things that are pointing at the realities of climate change and the kind of havoc that we've created here on the planet that's led to these kind of impacts that we experience. And now here in the Pacific, we tell the world very clearly that we're on the front line of climate change and ocean change, that we're seeing an ocean that our forefathers would not be able to describe. An ocean that was once abundant, and we're finding that we're not seeing the big fish as often as possible. We're not seeing the kind of life that we saw visiting Hawaii in the early 70s compared to what we see today. And much of this, again, is this whole shift and change, the interaction between climate and ocean, the two biggest systems on the planet, that resulting in what we're seeing in everyday life today. And again, we sometimes like to sort of think that that's someone else's problem. But the reality is it's our problem today, and we're on the forefront of it. You know, the challenge is what happens from here. And is there a role for the church? Is there a role for countries like Tonga? I think you'll find for small island states, or large ocean states as we like to describe ourselves in the Pacific, that on issues of climate change, we've done more, or we've had a massive impact on the global dialogue and on this. It's recognized our vulnerability, it's recognized that we're on the forefront, that some of our countries we're at risk of losing countries. You know, we might say things like, oh, it's Tuvalu, the low-lying island states, it's Marshall Islands, without recognizing that, you know, our islands in Hawaii, we've got low islands in Vava'u that stand with the same level of risk as many of our small, most vulnerable atoll island countries. And it's a reality for us in Tonga as well. And just recognizing the urgency of getting the world to commit to clear climate targets that can get a turnaround. And we're facing an uphill battle on this. The whole planet is facing an uphill battle on this. But you know, some of the good news in the midst of all of this is some of the bigger countries like China, the US now, have started to step up and say, we're going to have to do something like this, because they are taking big steps on climate because it's starting to impact them. I'm going to stop there. I think the conversation and the questions will probably make this more interesting, but I appreciate the opportunity to just share a few thoughts on this. And I think the network, the spiritual network of churches across the planet have a critical role to play in this as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Taholo. We'll go right to Latai, Taumoepeau from Australia. Malo Latai.
Hello, Johnny. Thank you very much, everybody, for having me, and apologies that I'm going to speak in English. I will just create a bit of context about what I do, because and how it relates to climate change. So I'm an artist, and I don't paint, and I make lots of different things, but mainly my work is involved in probably interventions, which I think sits in the realm of favor. And so my work is in performance, but a few years ago, I found myself responding to a document that my local member of parliament, their government had written, which was what is Australia's responsibility to its nearest low-lying island neighbours. And so I invited the Anthony Albanese, that's his name, to come and speak to the community of where I live. And from there, I found myself a delegate at the climate change, United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2007 with Pacific people from different islands. And we were presenting a side event for world leaders that was in support of the Pacific leaders that were there. And I learned a lot at that time, and it actually informed then what I should do with my arts practice, which was more than 10 years ago now. So I've been making work about the impact of climate change on the Pacific. And although that sounds like it might be commercial or trivial, I find myself in these places where there is some influence. A few days ago, I designed a cake that was cut by Gladys Berejiklian and Margaret Beasley, the governor, and these people. And so the thing about the arts is its influence on culture and high society in developed countries. And so I find myself in a very particular position where I think creating a voice that represents the Pacific nations as a person of the diaspora is a way of bringing climate change and the impact of climate change to certain people's laps. I mean, I think a really important thing is thinking about the impact of the way that young people, I think, that are thinking about it is what their future looks like. And several years ago, a group of Pacific people made their own very small kalia and transported them to Australia, and they held a flotilla to block the largest coal port, which is in Newcastle in Australia. And I found that a very moving protest that didn't end in the usual way that some protests end. It was a really beautiful experience for many protests that learned from the way of our people. They sang, they prayed, and they floated and blocked the coal ships from leaving the port for a day, which was a really great intervention, but it also made an impact on the way that people start to think about how they consume in Western culture and who that impacts. So the way that part of the narrative that happens in Australia is that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for the carbon emissions that will cause the displacement of Pacific people in the future. And I think, yeah, it's closer for some people, some islands who are more lower lying than Tonga. But I think a lot of the research that people are doing is about looking at food security, how salt levels coming through the water table is impacting the food gardens. There are people who are already relocated from the Carteret Islands who are already, and they're matrilineal, and they've been negotiating amongst themselves about moving to higher lands. We've seen now in Kiribati have bought land in Fiji for agriculture, so then they can feed their own people. So we're seeing the relationship between the Pacific being a very special way that we deal with things, but it's very important, I think, for Australian Pacific people and New Zealand Pacific people to really get behind lobbying their own governments about that. We've seen headlines, in the last 5 years, our Minister of Immigration at the time, Peter Dutton, was making jokes about, sea level rise in the Pacific that was caught, off camera. Prime Minister Scott Morrison also is not making any major decisions that are going to really assist how the Pacific is going to deal with these impacts that aren't too far away. So I think my interest is mainly in how those of us who live in developed countries are able to throw our power around to enable the future of our lands. I grew up with my grandparents making sure that I have a sense of belonging and and home and connection to Tonga. And so I feel that that's what fuels a lot of my activism. I would say it's pretty soft activism. It's not necessarily creating any systemic change right now, but I think the more and more people who live overseas, particularly young people, are trying to become more and more aware of how they create campaigns that are going to interrupt the fossil fuel industry. So simple divestment campaigns are really successful. Changing banks, you know, from the major 4 banks to other banks who don't loan to the fossil fuel industry is how regular people are starting to enforce their power on the governments. So these are non-violent ways of approaching it, which I think is really important for some of our people. Nobody wants to be in a position where they're in a lot of trouble. So it's been really important for many campaigners and NGOs to think about what's more suitable for Pacific people to what actions can Pacific people do that aren't going to put them in a lot of trouble. I think another issue that that we're seeing is climate change fatigue, and also the fact that people don't have time to learn all the science or the economics. And for me in the arts, part of it is creating works that generate empathy for people to think about the way that Pacific people are going to be experiencing you know, more and more these impacts. I think maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, malo Latai. Fa malo lah ya tu kia ting modal ko do Ungatea ka Palatasa mo Latai pe mo Taholo. E ko na tau kamata e tau talanga I he fehu I ko ha tau me fai au kai ke fo mahino ia I he komiti ko ni ku na fo matala maga Ungatea ko ha me tau me e fai ko kakai lotu ka kakai Tonga pe I ha ko ni o me tau ko Mamate ā-takaí. Ang mahino me fa matala a Palatasa o ia balbare mai o topo ko hi ko whakalakalaka. Ko kaponi ko ni o tau kona ia ai ko veve ia o development whakalakalaka industrialization lau ko ia ko Taholo. Kau gai be mo me ma inga ke tau whakau giai angena lau gia Taholo ge greed tau manu hori ge ko ne ka fo be ka nga abi ka fo o mo au ko kai ke whakatoka nga ia ko veve ko kasa o ka go ia o ka ua mo tolo ngai abi ni kai ke fie lue at begi fare koloa kai he ka me alere ko mauinga ni me mauinga o tanang me Latai ka me food security tau ko si at ke taimi ko ose tau me akai te tau ma me fe kona hia ai kere kai ke te mo ui hapu mani o ke ia fe reva mo ui tau kakai kai ke fa malo la hia tu ki he kau hawhanga I ngai fotu whakau ka pau ge ha taha ge ne fe hui foto mai he chat pe ko response I Facebook ya ko UESILIANA tene toki tufi mai ai ngai fe hui ka ko ha fa fogat ge Ungatea po Tasa po Taholo mo Latai po gane mo te whakalai mai.
Malo pitioni ku hangi pe ko lau ko he mahal ko ki ngau ko no ma o ku fat me SIASI an ko ki komiti ko ni aya o ku e mahal ka me mi pe to fitu nai ku whakamanatui ka ko whakaamu fuksione ke kaua te SIASI ki tālanga ko ni mo whakakau I o ngahi mea ke whai he whonua whakalupua. I ko hanga mahe ni whoki ngai u mea peheni o o hen foke ni han ko hala ngana mo na to Palatasa mena na ngau he pure anga he me ki ha upe foke ngai utala noaya o fai pi he pure anga ai tu faki nai o ngai ilo ko nangi utala noa ke Palatasa ka ko mahino ko ki hanga fide motuani pe mo ki komiti ko ni e ha ufoka Palatasa ia o uia tu tau fatata ko pure anga uia ki grup ke na fai ke na ki tala noa ki workshop we no fo pai fo ke e tantai fai kau ia i he siasko si one mo mea i no api peko ona e fale lotu peko no api no fanga ko ne alo hake peko ana ke tu unga o fai ne fo i malanga o ne pehe mai ko lahi eni o mo tawanga hala patau tari pe tau toru ia ngahi u mea ko no koko o kuia e foi kulupu ia e whanongo le rei pe ia ke foi whakahino-hino ko ia. Aia ko mea ia ko whakama SIASI ke kau atu ke pure anga ko uhi ke ki tafe mai ai ngahi ilo koni o mou mao koni e mou tolu me ngahi tapaaki o mou homo mala e ia me he ngahi potungai pure anga ke lava ki hange o mao mo ilo lele yang ki ai e kau ngau e ko i mala e o lotu ko uhi ke lava ke fai haki hawhengawe aki lele yang aia ko uhi ke hange o lava ke mahino hange kona ko ki whamatala Palatasa ko e hae buesia e kāponi e ngahi ume pehena os fai piki savea ia e whengawe aki ko ni hange haki bakai pe ko e hae pakotola e kau tangatai whewhekau ne whai kia eke na nau pehe utike kia hako te nau kau ki ai ko mea pe nau uilo nau tolu ki he mea ko ni ko nau whanki mea nau whanonga he reti o mo basically he media ai ko muhinga fokia e tau e whenga atu ai SIASI ke pure anga ke whai ha whemai no aki o ko whe halanga te tau ngau e aki ai ko uhi ke te ilo lahi angi whinemotu ania ka po whinemotu a whaiwhekau ko au ke ngai u ilo whakasai nis whakano poni he ilo te maulawa lewa sio ke tau pehe o whewhe e tau malangai o ngai mea ko o whewhe whakatoi tapu hai lau e toi tapu e ku neongo whuke tala mea Taholo whuke na ki pekohane fui ki lau whakatoi tapu mea Taholo ko ke ufulo i Taholo o pekutonu ho mau ka ki isio ke ne pehe ko o tala mai toi tapu ke tau hoko ko kau setuata Kata ki pe moto ko ni kau lotu kau ako toi tapu o koe foki ko afuna o ki huk se tau tai pa ko kumahina ko katea o koe foi konga tala mai o koe i se nesi pe vai waki ke mo o kwange koe ki whakawhekiki mautori to have dominion over ko foi teolosia ko ia ke ute tokanga ta ko e Taholo ke ute pe o ne ta mai ko ka ki uhanga e pure e fu mama ko ni o whakaton lea i pe o koe ne UESILIANA ai ki fonga ko e whakakaukau ke mamani mo hoku wā mo mamani. That's why we do hange ko nu fai ke fai discussions ko ya ko hi ke hanga influence ai fonga te tau unu atu moia ki he kahau i he isiu ko o Mamate o ā-takaí he ilo e aha ngahi ririu i he ngahi messages o kau me SIASI.
He tau ki whanau no o koe palpare mago ni o tupua e Mamate ā-takaí koe whakalakalaka kai ke te whehui ia whamai no e sai nisi o kou kau me toi tapu he palpare ma ko ni hanga tuwaki mai e whahinga ā-takaí u whangofua e whahinga tangata ke whakabarebare hange ko mea kono ke whamatala ke ai Ungatea Peko mea ia kuhinga ke Taholo, peko Taholo ku ke peko hapa peko sai ki afe ki Palatasa ke afe hu ia se fita o ku I he chat. Mahalo ko tu wange a no alofa ke meremo ka hike ko muagi honua, peko hiki ki ne yafu malunga. Taholo mo Palatasa mo Latai ki mea mo fe hu mai
Ia o lahe o me ki tau tala no ki ai. Da tau bebe whakasainisi, whakasosiare, me whakatohi tapu me ulahe. Ko si avena aku ke carbon print ko a Tonga, taha hiwa fitu noa na e ofi he toni taha mano. O no produce go he person. I mean, carbon print ko a Tonga go lahi e carbon go. Pa go taha hiwa, go wafe taha hiwa, o gua o toni taha kilu ono mano. O taha kilu fit mano. Ai aku whakalakalahi a Tonga he ko taiminiku. He ka hange peko mea ka nalawa ka Taholo ai anga e tau sio ki he kā e tamako. He ku kawa Tonga ia he whakaware he mea koerere mea lere. Peke tau kei lawa ta tolo o lue mo ai pe ha whahinga mea ke whakasi iange kāponi, he koe kiwi a koe he hala e Tonga, me mitatau mo kiwi toki o. Te lere mei vaini ki kolo, o me hoa taha pe ega o sikoe mo to don ke lere pe me te nima me tamu fu. O mea pe, koe ke ila ea, ki ula me ea pe fefe hano control mea koe ya. A koe nea koe ke heta whaaki whakafolofola, o kulahi a wite o mea o to don ke tau tokanga ki ai. Pako popo elahe la ko a Taholo mai lo ko ngalahe ai mea whaka teologia te tau ki peiti. Ka go dui ki he responsibility ko a tangata ke look after the world. And ange koe ke ai mo atama ke nao tau he ngowe na ange ka nao ke nao o tokanga ke ngowe. Ai ko tokanga ke ngowe o ku kawai, Imu ain bea toki tō, pe ngā toki tō ko he mea. Ka kono mōni ana o kulahe ai umea umea ke tau whai. Hange koe ni, o ku tau mateu ke tau face a climate change. He koe liu koe a climate change o wawe au pito ia. Ai ku alo he taimini ke fo i ta whaage o exponential. Nere koe ai, lahe climate change o fu wawe au pito. Paka mea rewa o ku hoko mahawin ke taro he hae ngahi matangi o to la lahe ange he ngahi a whaakon ku tau sio ai. Ke si ngahi whare la lahe i Amerika une meu ki mo mea. Ai ko tau whangi whare ko i Tonga ko keresi pene ai o tua o tau ki lelelere atu ai. Ko e tsunami. O ke kia fu whakamatala lere i whakapoto i pe whakawhika. Pe hame na ke stay polo ki tu wai fangi koro ko ni he fo i tsunami ko ni i Indonesia. E na lere tsunami a o ke Amerika o ke don ke fo watu he fangi fo nua ko nange ko Tonga mo fe fua e Pasifiki. Ke hame ai hoka nau tolo. Ai ko he ko SIASI, ko ngala he SIASI ia ko ako be ke ilo o mea. Na o si ahe o tua ai. Pe ha SIASI na nau to ya o fakatu o create whainga mea fo halata. Paku tau hanga na to ai mea whaka SIASI ke ne determine taimin paku ma tolu ko na ngau he akademika. Ko curriculum mo ha fua o lere he Taiwanism. Paku tau dole au tau tui tatu ke o tua mo hui. Paku alo lewa taimine ngai polisia ngai fonua. Ke alu tai whakafolofola ia hange koe. Afu ke humanism, hange koe ni ko sinania na pasi whakawawe lau ki he whakatoa tāma he tau wosi. Kono ki mui tau wosi. Ai koe pepe e tahamana tolua whena e whakatoa ke tau wosi. Tahamano mahake tau wosi ka puke wafe tahamano. Tahamano wafe tau wosi. Koe pepe ia whihamano. Koe hainga mea pe, aku hiu ke nau tui ke mea ko whamatala e tohi tapu. Ako ne awhe koe e tohi tapu whamatala ke mea whakanatu lama mea whakasainisi koe tonu pasi ka moni. E iu mai haku taimi hene ke utaranoa te ngai mea whakafolofola ko taramai he folofola ke tau whai. Aku toka hape sainisi o puru e mea folofola. Ako no moni o nea koe tonu pasi ka moni o mea whamatala e tohi tapu ke sainisi. Ande Ungatea na wangu tano fuforo.
Malo tas. Oke ko Elizabeth ko ya me tokangia. Ya me ngai fehui. Ya chat mo kata ko ki hila ko begai. Elizabeth.
Eu malo apitacione, pego kolpe ke hufanga ngai fratapo tope ko osona fake kamataanga e hafangani. Ka tabe mo oke watu haki whakaukau. Porotua tupe me o ki turiki whanongoa ngahi whakaukau o mai. Pea oku ohake pe ai mivili mea te au ke ukau noa atu I he tala noa. Ka te ulako atu pe haki ki whakawhailoaki atu e whine motu ani ko hingoa ko Elisabesi Happy Havea o ko whakakaunga tāmaki atu o ko whakautua atu me he vai tawhi wai kato me he militoni. Ne tok lava te whainga ako I he tau ko osi ko hoku PhD ai ane whakahoko ia I he climate change education in Tonga and secondary schools. Pe ana e whakahoko e ku master I he understanding climate change I he I Tonga pe ka I he ngahi kolo. Pe o ko lolo Tonga whakakaunga tāmaki University wai kato ko e toko tawhai ako I he ngahi pepa sustainability I he tawhaki education. Pe o ko whakakaunga tāmaki he science learning hub I he University wai kato ai pe ko e develop o ngahi climate change resources. Pe ia taimi ni o ko lotonga ngā ue ki he develop o ngahi resources whakatonga pe aluia I he website I ko ia mautolu ai o ku free pe. Ia taimi tatau o ku osi o mai ai whamatala ke te au me he kau taki o mau ki tuli koe ni, e malawa ke mau print e ngahi resources o tukot ko hinga pe koe ola ki whekumi na ku whakahoko ko ia I eku PhD. Pea koe ngahi whepōtala noa aki koe koe na o ko whanongo ai koe ki he o whakahoko he pōni, o ku whelawe I au pito ia pia mo ki ngā ue koe na o whakahoko, ta tau pe I eku masters ka uma a eku PhD. Hange koe koe mea Dr. Ungatea Kata, ki he whatongia koe ia ai SIASI. I he whekumi koe na ku whakahoko na e malawa ke u mauai ha whakamatala koe SIASI koe kawea ha foi body. Pe ko ha foi sino, very powerful ke ni hanga o address like climate change I Tonga. Hange pe koe ko tau whanongoa e tau tana oku. There are two main approaches to tackle climate change. This is mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is dealing with the causes of climate change. How are we going to reduce carbon emission? And I ko mitigation nia aia ko whakaloloma taha he o ko Tonga pia moe o mot pasiki o now contribute the least ki he cause of climate change ka ko now tolu o ko now whepaki lahi taha pia moe palo palema. Hange aku fuulahi e tau tokanga ke how are we going to mitigate? Ka koe whekumi koe nei whakahoko o ku ai e fumaho inga ke tau sio, how are we going to educate our people and our church members how to adapt? Koe ngahi adaptation ko ke develop he ngahi family ka umai pot SIASI.
9:00.
Sai pese ane?
Ia hokat ko Elizabeth.
Aia koe na malawa ke mau e ngahi whakakaukau koe hange koe na mea ke aia Dr. Kata. Koe lahi e tau kāinga Tonga nau pehe koe feliliuaki o ea. Koe lea ia ngā aki, that's an official term ko ngā aki koe Tonga. Pa o ko malia ia pito hono ngā ake fo i lea ko eni ko mamate ā-takaí. He koe fo i tahaya fo i finding e na umau e au ia he eku research. O koe feliliuaki o ea is misleading. O ku nehanga e ea cause confusion I he interpret ko koe e he kakai ai climate change. Hango feliliuaki e ea. And I really like the term. He ko tahaya e ngā ua ko a taumu au ko hanga ke he taimini ke hanga o whakaukau ha fo I term ke ngā aki whakatonga ki he climate change. He ko tui ko feliliuaki e a ku kauia hene ki hanga o mislead ai kakai o Tonga I na interpret ko o climate change as a whole. Ai te wafe mai lewa ki he ku PhD. There's so much information, but I know the time of SIASI. Ai ko e ku PhD na u whakahoko e ku field work I hapai. Ai na ngā aki ai apiako e ua, ai puleanga, pia moe apiako ko e SIASI ta whahau pilo levu. Ai na mahino mai me he, ana ngā ue pia moe level year 10, ai koe form 4. Na mahino ke te au ai hoko ai palema koe ni o kune wesia ai kakai la lahi o a upe ki whanau iki. Koe talanoa koe ni na kua o mau whepota na me whanau ako I he loki ako. Pena e ngahi loi mata na e tō. Ko I ngā ko e nau ilo whakapapau o kuesia ki nau tolu e he feliliuaki ea. Kawai mo nau ngahi experience ko I he cyclone Ian. Toko lahi au pito na nau pick up I Ian. Pena whakamahino I he whanau ia o ku hoko ai climate change pa koe palo pale mai ka nau tolu. Pa koe tui koe mea mahu inga ia ke tauhanga o whakatokanga I. Koe hālewa e tau mea e whai. O ku mahu inga o pito ke tauhanga o atu a information to tonu. Like for example is science. Aia ki mua ko koe pe whakahoko, ai nei whakahoko e ku exploratory. O mauai o kuai ngahi alternative conceptions. Misconception o mahi both e whanau ako, pe mo e kau whai ako. Pea o whakamai lewa o whao a e ku ki intervention. Pea o whakatu lewa o trial, pea evaluate e mea ko iana e lahi ngahi mea na whi mahi whanau ia o kuai e nau suggestion ke whoki ai mo ui ki he ngahi mea ki mohang koe whaunga o e kuki whei mea toko ni. Koe ngau e aki koia o e mea lele. Ai o lahi ngahi whaunga na nau hanga o mai e ngahi whakakaukau ko ia. Pea o koutui koe uhinga lewa e nau o mai e ngahi whakakaukau ko ia, ko hinga koe nau mau ai fo I mahino ki he tupuanga o climate change. Ai anai. Kia te au mo e ku hausia koe nā ku mau, o ku mahu inga o pito ke o atu a information to tonu, especially ki he science around climate change ke tonu ki he kakai, ka public, kai malawa lewa me iai ke nau develop, nau ngahi adaptation, ka mai ngahi mitigation approaches koe nā ku lawe koe ki ai. Aia ko tuipe mahalo koe ki whakamatala pe ia o fie o atu, whakaampe na e lahe taimi, ka o ku lahe ngahi mea maho inga o pito ia e malawa hangoi kulupu koe a Ungatea, na e malawa ke uilo o koe ki kulupu pea mei he climate change department, pea mo kulupu me Ministry of Education o nau whengau e aki. Ka o mahino it's not effective. Ka koe ki kulupu ko o ku talanoa ki ai toke tā Kata, o ku whia mau ke whakahoko e fo I ngau e ko ia ke nau whengau e aki, pea mo e pot ngau e ko ia e Meidek, ka o maa ka pau e lava o mai pe mo e pot ngau e ako, o ko stia pe me ku tawha aki, o ku fumau inga o pito ke tauhanga o whakakau me whanau, ke tauhanga o approach e curriculum ai ngahi ako, Ko tui mahal ko siya tau tai o tonu ke toi review mo na curriculum ke hu ai climate change i he tafaaki ko ia. Mahalo na Slava ke hu at ke Trinity College i heni. Ka ko tupe malo oku lahi pe ngahi fo. Nga ko ki tāna ke tupe ia e sione me tafaaki. Ka tape kind of like jump around. Ka oku lahi opite ngahi me ke whaika whakamatala ka te Ungatea.
Malo Elizabeth. Pangapang ko ni kia Taholo.
Just a couple of really quick stories. I like the thing on our traditional knowledge, and I remember my father building a house in Ātakaí on the foreshore, and then he started planting trees in front of the ocean on the beach. And for us young people, we thought you should cut the trees down for a view. Traditionally in Fiji, places like this, no one built on the foreshore because we know what it's like when there will be the storm that wipes everything out here. And the trees on the foreshore became the only protection the low-lying islands had in times like this. Our Western perspective is we've got rid of all this. Everything's about the view. We've forgotten some of the old ideas and the old things that allowed our people to survive many years. Another story, just a quick one, a Tongan missionary came from Northern Australia with an Aborigine leader. And I remember him talking to us in Ātakaí at that time, where they'd gone diving for uo. And he said he'd never seen so much uo in his life. And all he could think of was filling all the eskies and thinking of all the people he can send the uo to after that thing. And then he said, he asked the Aborigine guy, what about you? And he took 2 or 3 uo. And he said, this is enough for my family to eat. There'll be some here when we need some more. And I think there's been a perspective, a shift in our thinking that we need to start to think about reoccupying our spaces as Tongans and as people of the Pacific, and not hoarding and the kind of things that we're doing today. And you again can tie this to what does this mean in a shift of our thinking and our lifestyles today. And then finally, just the thing on adaptation. And I think the biggest opportunity for us as a country is starting to say, is adaptation and climate change, does it provide an opportunity to develop on the kind of direction, an economy that deals with food security, that restores what we should have and sustains us. Adaptation that looks at energy, that in 10 years from now, we're totally solar, we're totally renewable. It looks at our motor vehicles and our shipping, where we can meet global targets, but be ahead of it, not just chasing on the second-hand market, but starting to say, how can we be in the forefront on the kind of development that benefits us? Infrastructure, and then the final big one is health. And there is a connection. I once spoke somewhere, we're saying, we talk about healthy oceans and suddenly realized it was more, we should be talking about unhealthy oceans and unhealthy people rather than healthy ocean and healthy people. And suddenly realized that if we can reconnect to what we've lost, we can also start to rethink about what does it mean to be Tongan and healthy, and in terms of identity and spiritual responsibility. There might be some connections here to think about, that climate change starts to challenge these very basic things of who we are. I'll stop there.
Hello, Taholo, ko buifefe hui mea iki. Itei no be iki.
Ia no pe marama whamare motoani ka iloa ko ki motoa petu pohake ka waiha ano mi whakakai.
Wala hitam kau hapai.
Tako whakanga tamaki ko whaiwhinga a ko toke tā I he malai accounting. O ku mahino ka te mahuinga mawhatuktuki o Kaveinga. He koe whainga Kaveinga uhange koe whakarea pe mei moto pe he koe tahi hua mai. Ka I he tahi hua mai ko ia I he tawaki o whaigai whakatotoro ai motuani o ko sio whenga he public values. Pa koe taha ene ngā he public values wi Tonga. Pe anga whi hatau whenga ke tau hangao. o solo vai paraparema. Kono moni ke lava solo va hanga ko me kona lava ke ale se pesi Havea ke ta lava mitigate ko fo ile nga aki he ta fakoni I accounting I ko si ke ta faki o resilience pe ko mateu teu pe ko toka teu. Na fai whenga ki Tonga o mahino me I Tonga ko ngahi paraparema ko hoko mo mateu teu a Tonga ko tau mateu teu o ku fai tua kauta. O ku fai he o se foi paraparema. O si e fo ia fa mo fo ia fa pa ko e fa ko ke to tahape ta fo tonga ko ne hape fo ia fa muy mai fo ia fa ta hoko muy mai fo ia fa e ko si e tu ngai to ton ke ta a level ma te ke o te tau ke tu ka ta ma te kai fai ki mu a ma te pa ku la hele ma ngai me e si o ke hange ko ko hinga ko to ka ta he la ko to ta Ungatea ko ne ho ko fo I a fa ai ta tok tangu to sio ke ngai pure ngalalahi no sila mo Australia ko ha to ko ni fa paanga mai ke o mai to ko ni e Tonga ka ko e tafaaki oku it's a very hot issue he tai min he accounting ko ha fa tongia accounting ke whakahoko mateu teu mo matu e kina o programa o Kaveinga programa ki ha fa ki mua pe hoko fo ia fa pe ki mua pe hoko mai pe hua mai ai tahi XCI ke tawhaka insurance, fe langa o e whare, fe hono ako e whanau, ke nau maheno. Oku cyclone proof, hono langa ngahi whare ko toa pe, oku iai hapatset e pure anga ku wahei, os mahene ku pau ke hoko e a whaa ia. Ko e havo I paanga ma kua wahei he patseti, ke o sian koe parapare ma oku tokoni. Ka ngā peki I lawe atu he tawhako e ko hinga koe no e taimi, ka oku lahi apu te ngahi mea ku wako ma motoro I whiawhine. Lewa mara.
Malo, Iki, I'm going to give the final chance to Latai. You spoke of climate fatigue. Piko ia kakai ia he tautara noa koe ni. Well, how do you, and there was one of the questions raised, how do young people in Tonga think about climate change? And as an activist, how would you activate the young people in Tonga, young people of Tonga who are in diaspora, to be more active, to take this seriously? This is not an issue. This is not an issue. This is a life and death situation. It's a struggle. Latai, can you help us on that?
I think, firstly, there was a young person from Tonga who was murdered on the weekend, uiké, who was an incredible activist and an environmentalist and humanitarian. So there are young people in Tonga that are doing some really incredible international work. The project I'm working on right now here in Melbourne is a 5-year project called Refuge, and it's an artist-led project where the Emergency Management Victoria are collaborating with artists to enable communities to prepare for the increased increased disasters, flooding, heat waves, all of these things. We just saw just a few short months ago when Melbourne went into a 115-day lockdown, and the communication meant that the most marginalized and vulnerable people in this city were further marginalized and were the most impacted. They didn't speak much English. There was no communication in their language. They were locked in these towers. They were people with disabilities, weren't able to access food. So these are the things that this project that I'm working on, Refuge, the emergency management, because they run their systems are based on a very top-down military system. They're looking at ways to intervene and for us to experiment, because we experiment with things, because we're autonomous. We don't belong to organizations. We have no, agendas in that way. So part of it is imagining new ways, innovative ways that we collaborate with scientists, economists, all kinds of people, agriculturalists, farmers and things like that, to imagine newer ways to adapt fast and to mitigate all sorts of problems. That's what we're looking at, the problem solving. The thing that's a really big issue is the responsibility falling on the developed countries who have created all of these problems. I think putting a lot of pressure on the Pacific, you know, ā-takaí calls everybody like that says that we're part of the ocean. The way that the Western world looks at the Pacific is small islands, insignificant islands. So I think the young people and the generations now are trying to say, we are actually at the center of this, and you need to listen to what our people are saying. And in the Pacific Islands forums, they have been putting a lot of pressure on governments like Australia to make a lot of these changes. But it's very difficult when the education isn't getting down to people to understand how powerful their voice can be inside during election time. I'm seeing it inside my own family. I'm fighting with people in my own family, trying to get them to make better decisions, you know. And I think hearing from church leaders who are talking about stewardship and talking about, considering us people as part of the natural world rather than humans being the only, being prioritized alone in the natural world is quite radical. And I think, more of these conversations need to be had and followed up with action, and pretty fast, because the temperatures targets that we're looking at, Australia's saying, you know, it's not going to meet. It doesn't look like Australia's going to meet any of these Paris Agreement targets. So I think putting more pressure on these governments is really the main thing that's going to change. I mean, of course, plastics is important, but at the end of the day, that's a very small issue compared to bringing down the carbon emissions and bringing down fossil fuels. Tokelau, I think, has already moved to full solar. But again, I think the pressure has to be put on Australia, countries like Australia, who think they're a big power in the world, but actually they're just bullying the Pacific. And that's, I think, the way that most of us diaspora think about Australia. We're not scared to stand up to these governments because we're from here. And what we want is for people from the Pacific to help to tell us how else we can push that agenda.
Yo, malo Latai. Te ki huat beheni ke tuange a kau whanongo me Facebook a nau ki marolog nau dol. Ka ko katau mo dol ya mo iwi katau te hokat be atau ki pau ne tolu katau tuk. Ka ko whamalo lahi atu ki mua batau koko gai whamalo lahi atu ki kau hawhanga ke Ungatea ke Palatasa. Latai pe mo Taholo. Homo falanga talanoa lere mahina behe ka ke tau o fiema o ke hokwato talanoa ko ni ka fa fia asimaya irisa pesi ke mau ilo ke mau kore atu ka koe ke kau mai e fatalanoa pe mo fahinga ke na anga maheni agi fatongia ko ni Fola-he-Ngalú ke faito na tau mua ke faito taha kuata ya ku hiki hage no to taha mahina ka ku fu mau inga ai Mamate o ā-takaí ke tau ai hagi hu loto ka e tuku ke kore ke kau tau te pire ke nau tokanga mai ai ha whainga maari ko ia. O whamalo atu resa besi o whakamahu inga i mai ki Kaveinga ai Fola-he-Ngalú hena whakakata age Ungatea he kamata. Mamate ā-takaí. Mamate herea, mamate he tuku, mamate tango tu. Ai ko mamate e taha. Mamate e taha alu koe ke hange ku mate. Ture mate hif. Ka ngāwea ke ā-takaí he Fola-he-Ngalú o ikai koe whanua be. Ko tahi koe ā-takaí moia. Ko lolo whanua koe ā-takaí moia. Koe langi koe ā-takaí moia. Ka ikai koe tau tolu be whahenga tangata o nofo he ā-takaí. Tau kau ngā api mo whangamanu. Tau kau ngā api mo ulu akau. Aku ton ke tau sio whakalu ku fua. Pa koe ki popua ki benia ki he kau whanonga me he Facebook a ke waha malolo. Ka mo tau hilere ke ilahi be tau ngāwe ke whai. Ka mau ki hoko atu ki mau tolu mo whahinga i he Zoom. Kaike, ko tuange ate Facebook a ia. O kia mea ku te toka ngia hataha, tasa pia mo Ungatea. Na whange ko whahaki ako toi tapu hena tasa ka tau loa.
I'll just say before I hope to ako toi tapu e tasa. Ka ko kia te au sione ko ki prosek fo ko pe ko ki finga ke SIASI mo e pureanga o ku kai ke initiate mai me pureanga. I think ko foi mea mauinga ia ke taonga na e whakaka na alo atu pe SIASI ke pureanga ko uhi ko e neongoi o ku iai hono whatongia ko uhi ko mea nia o ku hange ko lau ko i siu e nia ko mea nia o ku ea ni whikau akanga tonu mo ui e tō tātonga i tongani o pe e alu e ke to e lahiani. Ka ko hui ko hange ku ne whakakau e no whatongia whakatau sipi. Mo mahino pe whoki e sione ke tūkunga ko o ta au e taimini. O koe e whakangata mo tō no. I he ilo mo e whaunga whai whatongia a SIASI ke uhi ki hange whehanghangai me ngahi mea fo au pe heni. Ai au ne fie mawai ke to le yang a en whekau aki ia pea mo ngahi u ilo i tua. Ko iai o ke te au ia koe fo i koe mea mahu inga ia ki whirimotuan ki hange o kungulawa SIASI o hange o ki sio ki tua. O ikai ke sio mau pe o hange e taim lahi pe foki ko whakatu tāmaki o whotu SIASI, ko sio pe koe kiloto. Kai ngalo ai Kaveinga ia koe o tua ko sio ki tua. Whakautui i he whainga maari e nia ki he SIASI UESILIANA ai hange whakaukai puranga ki hange pailate i he SIASI UESILIANA pia sio ke hoko atu mga SIASI ki. Ke lava ai ke mau ki sio ki tua.
Palatasa?
Io, se le kadaka se fita ko fe penka Ungatea, lo Tonga e a whanga maari ko ni. O kuia ha whenga ai SIASI ke nau pikinima mo ngahi SIASI ke he. Ke nau o whakataha ke pure anga ka pau koe me ai to tonu ke whai. Pe ka pau pehe, pe ka pau o whainga taa ke pikinima ai kāinga lotu he mea koe ni. E whewhe ai ala hatau sio ke lava ke nau whai taha. Ko hike hoko ia ko ha reo, pe ko ha potanga kakai, o ku mahu inga e nau tokoni ke mea koe ni hange koe na e nau whanau ke lava e nau peo kau e ai whaingalo tupe koe SIASI. E ngai grupu matu aki mahu inga ki he ngau e koe ni. Kau haa mai whoko, kui ai pe mapakipak mo i mawahe pehe. E tau sio ki Tonga, pero e ke pepe o kia hafi pikitak nima pehe ngai SIASI i Tonga. Pe mahino mai koe mea whakamāmani lahi en. O kuia e nai hawhi mahino aki, ai ngahi toka te rine, whakamāmani lahi ke nau lava o ngā unu whakataha he mea koe ni, o ka paunga koe lawa koe atasa, o kia e ngahi whekau pe mga hi whamatala me whakainohino i toi tapu, o ku lava e ke na whengau e klerei mo sai nisi, ka lava ke tangu maundu atu ki he le volo hono hoko. Ko e ke pepe pehea Tonga i he sio a SIASI a UESILIANA he tai mini pe ikai ke nau take mea koe ni.
Malo se vita? Kia?
Iyo malo se vita. Maha koe kutai pikai o uaki, maha ko moutoro i muri u mapaki tinga mau kei whenga, te kenge mau mapakwak sisipi. But koe ki ho tari ki ho wheu i se fita, koe uhinga whuke mau ngā unu koe ni ki ngā ue lahi pa mo pure anga, koe uhi he koe pure anga o ke halanga koe ke mau ai seniti. Koe whui tari hanga tonu pia, he ke lava SIASI o kore hanga tonu e sirini ke GCF-a. Pau pe ke mau unu ke pure anga. Sai, koe mau unu koe ke pure anga, he ke lava mau toluia o whakamallohia foki, ai ngahi SIASI ke he se fita, ke mau unu whatahe ki prosek koe ni. Koe mea pe mau lava whai, koe mau whenga e me pure anga, i he whakakau tatau, koe kau me mipa koe i he komite SIASI UESILIANA, o nau i he ngahi komiti ai ko ke kau taki lotu. Pea o ku whai ai e whingawe aki koe mo kau mo ngai seskehe via e forum ko ia. Pea o ku whai os mahino pe ko mautolu te mauhange ka whai kamata prose ko ni te mauhanga o ki kamata ka aku pau pe e hu mai ki ai mo ngai seskehe. Ka koe katoa ngai mea ko ia o tau o ku whai pe ku whai ngau ki ai ko os ave proposal pa mau ke taitari. Fai pe ngā ue ia he taimini ka au kia taitari pe koe hae respond mai a GCF aki ai.
Aotearoa.
Se fita pe a hoko mā keneti. Ai ka dakitasa. Mā keneti.
Ungala mea nai ki kore ruka koe nau ai u tāno kia ka koe tāna ke mea koe nau lawa kia Ungatea. O koe taimini o ku wawa au pito ai international funds ke he u development koe hanga koe whanki whonua hanga ko Tonga. Koe mea koe nā lawa kia Taholo ane nai ke tau maha na kamata pe me ki kulupu koni o tokon ka Ungatea pa mo whonua mo push ke lahiange tokoni mai ai international fund ki Tonga tau pehe koe strategy ke o se afu i ta'o fiha me heni koe ke te ha uhila lere petrolo i Tonga. E fossil fuel. Kai lere me ahe renewable energy, ange tata fito ke he solar energy mo ai energy o ulawa mao me te au mo tahi mo hafua. E koe mahalo na koe solar farm koe na utu i Tonga mahalo na e whafufu koe varumiriona no whukotu ai aku ne lava kawa ko ngā lahe hui rato ngā pai aha ha whama pe he e nima pia i Tonga pia tolu i wawau pia ua i hapai ko ne osi ia e mea ma kei ke te aha he koe ka hafu me alahi ka koe mea ke whai taha ngai whonua Pasifiki o no lope international community koe palopare mai ni a mo tolu ko tonu ke he ko mau tolu ko mau safa mo palopare mai ai go me ape ke aha ke osiange tau tala noa ua no au go ai me ke mahino ka tau tomo tau ilo ka tau no foi be o hange go tau fa da fa mea ai go me au do ton ke tau fai ke tau fenga o aki o lava o push international community ai go me ani ala to ko ni ke SIASI ke pressure pureanga ke pressure international community ela he toko ni go ha ki Tonga ma ngai fono pe aku pakula be me aki ai ako tu e ko me afo ke ta ho mo ha ka tau to tau no foi Tonga pe aku tau tu i go au ka o tu ha me ako ni be kai and where is God in the whole saga pa aku kai ke tu i au oku mamao ai o tu me he situation he e ko vi ko hoka ngai me be ni ngai me ke whakalangang ai o tua pe koe whakaha hono i vi he ka tango tau lawa e toi tapu o ku lahi ngai extreme weather na wasi toi tapu tala noa ka noa lahi whaianga hala e whonua pia ta ange ka noa ke ngai fu waka pe ni te whakau he whonua ai koe te usio koe whakau ha koe whonua koe ka ki mea si whai ngofua o pito ke o tua ke whakau aku tina ngā rope o tua ke ta ofi uha o toi uha. Ka ne ngāwe ake ilaisia po hai me behe. Te kumare ia ta no ka pate mo la siope va he tong fitu ta no mare.
Oa.
Ke fa matala siope ke he hanga ko he o tua pure ta kai hola matangi mo e a mo Ra ke vesi konga vesi ua fa muy o kune o pehe it changes direction. This is talking about the air and the moisture and everything, turning around by his guidance, by God's guidance, that it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth, whether for correction or for his word or for loving kindness. He causes it to happen. For correction, Ula hawe da no ki hanga o to ngau ka na tula ke whakatontono no karai. For his well, ko whakarea whakatono the original Greek ko sustain the world, to sustain his world. E ko mai o uhage po a kauke mo e kakai. Or for loving kindness. Ai kau he ko expression ko ya kau ai no whakalangi ia he kakai ko for noa. Ko he ko plenty and supply for noa mo. Ai ko ta jim ko so sia ko pro he time ta no ai e do ta pu e au ke time ku tu he la e ke do la be tu he mai na ne u nga na ai fetu ko cosmic scale he au ko ka mi ala he ke o tua he ko u me ko fo matala ko he o tua ke a fo ko u me cosmic scale disrupt we ai ko fare fratonga pe nga to ngai malo hinga o mamani ngai planete he ai ko dugo mamani dai mini cosmic scale o sustain ngai force for natura he fe fusia ke ala a mo ha fo ngai planete to negi mare ai si be ai pa ko Taumoepeau ka do ai ko ka fu me ala he ka ko du ya do don ke Taholo tu e do me ko ni ka tau check it tau tol mo nga Taholo to e ula he tau o tu le manu be ai kai tau whenga lahi ke ngai mea kuti ke tau wako ke tau lahi ke sai ke mawanga Aotearoa pa tau ai business ke tau tumari ake koe lau ka Taholo ke tafuna ke pe tau manu ke tau te kakanga mea ke o ke koku lau pehe a koku aloki ka ta ngai mea kou sio pe au ka au te o mo oni koku dui ko au ka au tuha mea ko ni pe tau exist pe tau tori ange ko exist ko tau tailo ta mawani o Tonga ai ki fono ko tu ana tu kilang o tu ko Tonga pe UESILIANA tali te mo tu tu ko foi maranga guarda
e ho ka ko fa ulu ye tai minga dai Kennedy ki mo ba ho Kennedy ko fa fa mo tolu ki he programa ko sune Kaveinga ko fa kala ka mo ā-takaí e mahalo e hokolere ya ko halahingano i ako mo fa kala ka Pea uia matabure me se atau tai ko i awane Fiji hoi i he whakalaka mo mamate ā-takaí. E hoko at beta anoa ki sune, tato wakai na hu maha ki fo i paoa paasi si ulai katau tok sio ki ai. Kennedy, ni sekon be ua.
Tolo be, kau ki kawate tāra no maringa koe ni kia te au, hange o kuofiange a mea kou o mai mei Fiji mea Taholo ka mi, hange kone lau koe, it's more than just a science, ka kone lau koe ke moral pia moe spiritual. Ka ke, te whamama pia me religious, e ko tui pe te whai hei ai. Ka koe poinga kako pia tu, koe ka ta whakapolitikare koe i siu koe ni. Ka pau te ta whakafoki pe tau tolu ke whaunga kau Tonga, tau hā tonu pe ia i he tau sila. Koe lupe ka moe olive. Church and state o pau ke na ngau e whakata, o whakatau katea ka e wawe a hono addressa a i siu koe ni. Koe nanda e lawe pe kai to ka Ungatea ke ta whako ia a whia mau koe ke ngau e whakataha. Kai ke ta whakapolitikare o whenga mamani ia ke te ke ia si su me loto whare area. Hange ka mea ka ngau hoko i New Zealand ni, koe motuani ku i New Zealand, ka ko uiga ko tau noven ki Tonga. Ko mama o Tonga ia me whaunga koe tawal whitlima. Ka pate tau whoke komistu tone moe sila Tonga, koe lupe moe olive, ke na ngau e whakataha. Whatau katea pe te kawhataha, ka lava o siofe ngahi pa o premba kini. Ka kehe, kaki tānakat peia ki tāranga, that's my 2 cents worth, is for church and state ke na kawhataha, e whakatau katea, kai lawan. Ki tawhakawhakasi pe, i he wawhetahi wāke taim whamumina o Tonga ina, wele atu ki mui whanua, he wai befoke whaitoka ia i mui whanua. Pako whai eria koe ni, koe eria koe, na no holataki i mai koe o misnare, me hi fō, o nau hake ki motu koe na ko atata, o tāria ke hu tahi. Ka te wharewa cross mai me ai,
ki mui whanua an koe I puisopu. O I longa au pito pare ma koe climate change. Koe akau koe nei tuu bei whanua I taimi koe. Ko nau tuu nā taurita. Pena whai tātā noa moi toke tāne tatua Prescott kawhatofua. Pena whai ki tātā noa ki ta whakan koe proactive. O whakakau pehen. Ka pā lawa toko taha ko tau pei Tonga o tō ki fuakau taha I tau ko tau pei. Ka fuakau taha mano I ta. Tau pei ngofulu a koe taha miliona. Ka kehe. Koe me aia ki tau ngawe whakataha ki address issue koe ni. Ka kehe malo ka ki tāna ka te.
Malo abito Kennedy. Pero peko lolo po bang mahalo ku tau feunga. Kai ko whakaosien. Malo lahi atu te motolo kato ke tu be gango glau. Ke kume kau tau te bire programa ni ke pakai pe lava hua ki foi session eta. Ka wikai ke mena ve to kang famui moi ke atas kai ko tala noa pe. Oe ai ke pe ko tau ombe po lava pe pa os pa tuku ai. Ko ai fai ha mea. Nei fo me tahana ne fo tu he chat ane nai me fa mo plastic. Ko ngā ko malangai ngai SIASI ke ta ofio ngā ke plastiki he taimikai. Pe tau lau pe dato climate change hange be foi issue ka ko taim ko tau kai ai. Pelu mai plastiki ko mo foi la ko kai ke tau whatonga I ane whekau aki pe mo whakamamatea oi ā-takaí. Kai ke, o ko whamalo lahi atu, whawhonga atu ko asia ko makitoi toko ua mai behe fin ko pe mo isi, whawhonga atu isi whamalo ka te motolo no katoa. Pea mo toi mea mai pe sune. Koe aho ua sune, sai pe kona mo si resisita he Zoom, te sende atu pe ai whakamanatu ka te motolo.